And joining us now on the line from Fairfax, Virginia, Karol Boudreaux. She is Senior Fellow at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And Karol, as I welcome you to the program, I just want to start by asking our control room to bring up a map of Southwest Africa, because I suspect some of our viewers may not know where Namibia is, and that is the focus of our conversation tonight. It is a relatively young country, as you know, having gained its independence from South Africa only in 1990. Take us back to that time, though. What was the state of its wildlife and its economy then?
Well, as you mentioned, Namibia had been controlled by South Africa, and so many of the people living in the country, the majority of the people living there, were black people who had been subject to the same sort of apartheid laws and regulations that the South Africans imposed upon their black citizens. And so the country was significantly divided between very poor black people, many of whom lived in the countryside, and a small group of white folks who were much better off and who were making relatively good incomes. So when 1990 came, you had a really bifurcated country, many people poor, a small group of people who were relatively well off. In terms of the wildlife, there frankly just wasn't a lot of it in 1990. There had been some improvements since 1980, but the country was still in a place where wildlife numbers were relatively low, and the increases that we've seen over the past decade were waiting to happen.
Do they know why the wildlife numbers were so low at the time?
Yeah, wildlife numbers were low for a couple of reasons. Namibia gained its independence after having gone through a civil war with the South Africans. And during that civil war, soldiers on both sides of the civil war were shooting the animals. Sometimes they were shooting the animals to eat them, but other times they were shooting the animals, this would have been the South Africans, they were shooting the animals as trophies and then shipping them back to South Africa. So the ravages of war, shooting by soldiers, combined with some pretty serious droughts in the 1980s, led to extraordinarily low numbers of wildlife. And so by 1980, for example, there was virtually no wildlife left in the northwest corner of Namibia, which is called the Kunene region.
Now, you are the champion of something that has attempted to address both the animal welfare situation and the environment and the economic situation. It's called community-based natural resource management. What is that?
So this is an approach to dealing with wildlife and other sorts of natural resources that places the main responsibility for the management in the hands of local communities. In other words, the main control is not in the hands of maybe a distant, far-off national government or even in the hands of a provincial level government, but rather in the hands of the people themselves in their communities, the people who are living with the resources, who both benefit from those resources, but who bear the costs of having to live with those resources. And in the case of wildlife, it can be very costly for local people to live with wildlife because they're going to come in contact with predators, they're going to come in contact with large animals that cause damage, like elephants, or they're going to come in contact with animals that are migrating through their territory and competing with their local herds for grasslands, the way that, say, kudu or oryx or other sorts of antelopes do in Namibia with the local livestock, which is cattle or goats.
And why is local control or local ownership considered such a revolutionary idea?
It's an amazingly revolutionary idea because what it does is shift the incentives for local people in terms of how they look at the resources. So when you give local people control over these resources and you allow them to benefit directly from using the resources, they look at the resources as something that they own. And in a legal sense, they do really own those resources. And once local people have a sense of ownership over the resources, they treat the resources very differently. So they're willing to conserve the resources, they're willing to go to the time and trouble of providing water holes, for example, for animals in drought time. They're willing to give up some of their grazing land for these animals so the animals can have a steady source of grazing. So by empowering people with ownership rights, people begin to protect and conserve resources that in the past they would have poached.
Now that sounds like an economic rationale, but can you tell me whether there has been a kind of a cultural change in thinking as well from what you told us earlier, the kind of poaching and hunting to conservation?
There definitely has been, I would say, a rebirth of a cultural norm in Namibia. In the past, before, say, the colonial era, local people had a symbiotic relationship with the wildlife. Sometimes we romanticize these relationships, but it's certainly the case that there was a symbiotic relationship. And local people relied on the wildlife, both for meat, for the skins, for a variety of other reasons. During the colonial era, governments took away the rights to manage and control the wildlife from local people and placed it very far away in the capital city of Pretoria in South Africa. In the 1980s, when this movement was just beginning to get started in Namibia, this community-based conservation effort, traditional authorities were brought into the process and asked, did they want to live a life where their communities had very little in the way of wildlife? And it was the traditional authorities, the chiefs, the headmen in Namibia, who went to their communities and said, we must do something different. We've got to conserve these resources because if we don't do something today, in 1980, our children won't have these wildlife and they won't have the same sort of experience as Namibians that we've always had. So it was very important that traditional authorities and chiefs working with folks in the 1980s who were trying to protect these animals from outside, really non-local people, that those chiefs said to their people, we can do this. Let's work together. Let's stop poaching. Let's go back to the old way of our old relationship with wildlife. That was an extremely important component.
Yeah, but having said all that, I don't know many governments anywhere in the world that are prepared to cede control or authority over anything. So how were they convinced to do that?
This is an amazing story, and you're right, it's a very unusual thing to have happen. I think it happened for a couple of reasons. Number one, the transition from government control to local control took place after independence in 1990. So it was a critical period in Namibia's history, kind of a crisis period, and oftentimes in times of crisis, we see radical policy shifts, and this is nothing short of a radical policy shift. So there was this crisis. The control over the wildlife was shifting from the South Africans in Pretoria to Namibians in Windhoek. On top of that, though, there was a new minister of the environment called Nico Bessinger, who believed in this program. He wanted to see local people, local black people in Namibia, have an opportunity to benefit from managing wildlife. And importantly, this transition took place because there was a natural experiment in Namibia, which was this. White farmers had had these rights to manage wildlife and benefit from the use of wildlife since the mid-1970s. And on white farmland, this had been an incredibly successful experiment. White farmers were shifting from raising cattle to creating private game reserves, and the result was that their incomes were increasing substantially. So the government said, why not? We should be empowering our black citizens as well. They should be able to benefit from the wildlife resources that we have in the country. It shouldn't just be in the hands of the white farmers.
Now, I gather one key component to the success of these conservancies are the so-called joint venture lodges. What are they?
So a joint venture lodge is a commercial relationship that a local conservancy enters into with a private sector company, and this company would be in the hospitality sector. So a company that would build a big hotel or a small hotel, could be a very small boutique style hotel, would work with a conservancy that's managing wildlife to build the hotel, to at first manage the hotel, but would also importantly work with the conservancy in order to train local people to take jobs within the hotel or the lodge. So local people are trained at first to do relatively menial tasks, could be cleaning, could be helping with the cooking. But over time, the idea is that this private business partners with the local folks and trains them actually to become managers. A percentage of the income that the local, that the private game reserve or the private game lodge earns goes directly to the conservancy. So the conservancy is benefiting from having skills training, they're benefiting from having some income for the conservancy, and the private sector business is benefiting by having access to an area it wouldn't otherwise have access to. So it's a win-win on both sides.
Let's see if there's a win-win-win here. How about the environment?
Okay.
How has that changed?
Yeah, it's amazing. The environment has just completely rebounded in Namibia in the areas that are covered by conservancies. So if you were to look at, say, the numbers of wildlife in the northwest corner of Namibia, this Kunene region, you'd see that numbers of kudu have more than doubled. You'd see numbers of giraffe are up. You'd see that even endangered desert-adapted animals like desert-adapted rhino and desert-adapted elephant have also rebounded. And as these animals rebound, as the number of kudu or other sorts of antelope rebound, so too does the number of predators. And while this is a little scary for communities, it's actually very exciting because now communities are able to invite tourists to come in and see a more complete natural cycle. You're able to see the creatures who are grazing, but you're also able to see what it's like for them to have predators back and have that kind of wild experience. Similar sorts of success stories are taking place in the eastern part of Namibia, which is called the Caprivi region. Lots of elephant there now, lots of antelopes, but again, these predators coming back in force, and that's a good thing for the environment.
Let's talk about the economy, and actually you won't be able to see it, but our viewers will. We have a chart here that we're going to put up. This is total program benefits from the community-based natural resource management in Namibian dollars. We see in 1998, 1.1 million, not very much at all. Go along to 2000, it's almost more than doubled. By the year 2004, we're up to $14.5 million of revenues. By 2007, more than $39 million of revenues. Now, obviously, increased revenues is a good thing. Does the money get down actually to the community level so that ordinary people are being assisted?
You know, what's amazing about the Namibia program is that the money is at the community level. It's not going to district councils. It's not really going to the national government. It's staying with the communities. And then the communities are empowered to decide what they want to do with that 39 million Namibian dollars. They can decide either to distribute the money they earn on a per capita basis so that each household gets a little bit of income, or they can decide to put the money, invest the money in community projects. I've seen some communities who've decided to spend their money, say, purchasing an ambulance. Namibia is a very big country. There aren't a lot of folks. There's a long distance between towns and between hospitals. So some communities are actually buying ambulances so that they can transport their community members to hospital rather than having to rely on bus services or personal automobiles. Some communities are investing in schools, some are investing in medical facilities. So there's a wide variety of benefits that are flowing directly to communities as a result of that income that's being generated.
You are making it sound very positive, so you'll forgive this kind of, you know, somewhat more challenging question here. Whenever somebody does well, somebody else doesn't necessarily do well. And there are no doubt interests in Namibia that lost out as a result of these things. How are they handling all of this?
You know, so I think this is actually an interesting question, and I'm not sure that you're right, actually. I mean, in this case, the local Namibians who are benefiting are Black Namibians who live in rural areas, and before community-based natural resource management, their main form of livelihood was as small stock herders. They were raising cattle or they were raising goats. They didn't have a lot of other employment opportunities. And so family members were actually leaving the rural areas and going into the cities looking for work. Today, now they have some employment opportunities in their rural areas that simply didn't exist before. The way in which people might have lost is that the national parks may be attracting a few fewer people. But I think overall this is a tremendous benefit for the rural peoples in Namibia. They have opportunities that simply weren't there 14 or 15 years ago. And that looks to me like a win-win-win and not a win-lose situation.
No, I understand that, but for example, as these things do better and as they make profits and as the benefits of them become more apparent, you know, you almost think that the government will take a look at it and say, you know, we need a piece of this action. Are they going to want to have more of a say in how these things are run?
I think that's the biggest possible challenge to this Namibian example, which is an extremely strong example of having local people manage resources. Absolutely. As the conservancies do better, earn more, stand on their own, you know, so to speak, stand on their own 2 feet, the government naturally looks at the revenues that are being generated. They look at those 39 million Namibian dollars and they say, well, okay, you're doing pretty well now. Why shouldn't we have some of that? And to the extent that the government takes more of those revenues, it decreases the kind of incentives that people have now to protect those resources, to work hard to ensure that the environment is improved over time. And so it would be a terrible thing for the government to step in and really impose a heavy hand on the management that's going on today, because local people are doing a pretty terrific job there.
Well, another example, if the wildlife numbers are up, are you concerned that the government will allow more hunting to take place, for example?
So trophy hunting definitely takes place on the conservancies. It's actually the second largest category of income earned by conservancies is trophy hunting. Different conservancies handle trophy hunting differently. The government does issue some quotas to hunt desirable animals from a hunter's perspective. to conservancies, but some conservancies choose not to partner with professional hunters for those quotas. They feel it's preferable for their conservancy only to have photo safaris and not to have game hunting. I would think over time that conservancies should be given the freedom to make decisions about what they want to do with regard to hunting animals. I should say, very importantly for Namibia, the conservancy members themselves hunt the animals. So when there are a lot of antelope in the area, when there are a lot of kudu or oryx, the conservancies themselves will go out and hunt some of those animals and use the animals for what's called own use purposes, either to sell the hides or to use the meat to support local community members. It's a very important benefit for local people to have access to that protein and that meat.
Understood. Now, whenever something works, of course, the first thing many people ask is, could it work elsewhere? So let me just go through some of the facts here. Namibia's population, I gather, is about 2 million people. The second least densely populated country in the world. I'm not sure what number one is, but I'm guessing it's Mongolia, but if somebody else knows, maybe they can email and let me know. This is a piece of land the size of Texas and Louisiana put together. It's huge, not very many people there. So it's working there, but could it be exported, this idea, to work elsewhere?
Absolutely. This idea could definitely be exported. There's a lot of interest in exporting it. I was in Namibia last May, and I was visiting with some of the people who oversee this program, and was told then that over 60 different delegations from around the world have been through Namibia in the last several years looking at how the program works, trying to understand what's necessary in order to recreate a program like this on the ground in very different conditions. It's fair to say that this kind of program wouldn't work in some places. Now, another thing that's unique about Namibia, not only is it large and not only is it very lightly populated, it's stable. And that's kind of unusual for some developing world countries. So would this kind of a program work in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has not seen a lot of stability over the past decade? And the answer is probably not. It probably wouldn't work. Namibia is stable. It's a relatively open society. Could you have a program like this working in a society that was less open, less accountable, less transparent? Again, you'd probably have some problems there. So one of the great benefits of this program in Namibia is that local people don't have to pay bribes in order to keep the benefits that they're generating. So in a more corrupt, in a more conflict-ridden environment, this would be a difficult program to recreate. But there are a lot of parts of the world that are stable enough and probably open enough that you could recreate a program like this.
Carol, I suspect many of our viewers knew nothing about this before you came on our television channel tonight, so we're grateful for your time and appreciate you letting us know all about the community-based natural resource management. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.